Right now, there is this massive, completely empty cargo ship just floating dead in the water off the coast of Oman.
Yeah, the engines are totally quiet.
Right, the crew is just waiting. And because that one specific ship, along with like dozens of others, isn't moving through this narrow strip of water today, a mother in Nairobi just watched the price of her family's dinner completely double. So welcome to the deep dive.
Thanks for having me.
Today, we are really looking at what happens when the world's most critical geographic choke point just, well, flatlines.
Yeah, we're basically stripping away this this comforting illusion you might have that global trade is just this infinite, invincible web.
Right, like it just magically works.
Exactly. When you actually look at the physical geography of the oceans, you realize the entire global economy is hanging by, a few incredibly fragile threads, and one of them just completely snapped.
It's wild. We have a mission today that's going to pull us from like the high-stakes world of superpower conflict right down to the specific localized price of vegetables in a Kenyan market.
It's quite the journey.
It really is.
Yeah.
So we are extracting the crucial insights from a highly detailed, locally focused source. It's a breakdown by the HiiStory crew in Kenya. And they've provided this brilliant on-the-ground analysis of a massive global crisis, which is the complete closure of the Strait of Hormuz.
Which, just for context for you listening, has been entirely shut down due to a full-blown kinetic war between Iran and the United States.
Right, it's a huge deal. Now, before we really get into the mechanics of this, we need to lay down a very clear, hard boundary for our analysis today.
Yeah, definitely.
Our source material is dealing with incredibly sensitive, highly charged political conflicts. I mean, we are talking about a U.S.-Iran war. We are analyzing U.S. warnings directed at China, and we are unpacking Russian energy strategies that are, well, heavily capitalizing on this global chaos.
So to you, the listener, we want to be absolutely clear here. We are not taking any geopolitical sides in this deep dive.
None at all.
We aren't endorsing any nation's military actions, nor are we validating, the political narratives or moral arguments surrounding this war.
Right. Our goal is purely analytical. We are impartially reporting the facts, the data, and the on-the-ground realities exactly as they are presented in the HiiStory source.
We just want to understand the physics of the economic shockwaves,
Exactly. We are looking at the cascading effects of a closed choke point, not the political right or wrong of the trigger.
We're just following the math, the supply chains, and ultimately the human impact.
So let's establish the baseline here. The HiiStory source uses this analogy to explain this geopolitical choke point to anyone who might be new to global economics, like if you're a student. They call it the Matatu route.
I love that analogy. And for those outside East Africa, a Matatu is basically a local minibus.
Right. So imagine your local transit system, or like the single main road leading into your town's central market. If two massive bullies decide to have a violent, just no-holds-barred brawl right in the middle of that single road...
that he gets past.
Exactly. The trucks carrying fresh produce can't get in. Fares skyrocket because vehicles have to take these massive detours, assuming a detour even exists in the first place.
It's a really solid foundational analogy, but if we map the actual staggering data from the source onto that concept, the scale becomes just terrifying.
Yeah.
Because we're not talking about a local road.
Right. The Matatu analogy is great for a basic understanding, but it almost understates the systemic failure. I was looking at the numbers, and it's less like a blocked road and more like, it's like vascular constriction.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it.
If the global economy is a human body, the Strait of Hormuz isn't a capillary, it's the carotid artery.
That is much closer to the reality. I mean, the source notes that this specific waterway normally handles an average of 129 massive cargo ships every single day.
Every day. And these aren't just carrying, generic consumer goods, right?
No, not at all. This single narrow passage carries about 25% of all the oil that is traded by sea globally.
That is just insane. 1/4 of the world's seaborne oil supply is squeezed through a lane that is, at its narrowest point, only about 21 miles wide.
And it's not just crude oil either. The source specifically highlights massive volumes of natural gas and fertilizers.
But right now, because of the conflict, the route is just a ghost town.
Yeah, those 129 ships a day have just vanished. The artery is clamped completely shut.
Which sends these violent, immediate shock waves through the entire system. And I really want to dive into the mechanics of that panic, because economic systems, they don't just react to current supply, right?
They react to the absolute terror of future uncertainty.
Exactly. So the source breaks down the immediate fallout. Brent crude oil shot past $90 a barrel almost instantly. But the more alarming figure, like the one that really signals systemic danger, is natural gas.
Yeah, the source cites a 74% surge in natural gas prices in a matter of days.
74%. Now, the reflex reaction for a lot of people is to think, okay, gas is up, oil is up. This is a fuel issue.
Right. It's going to cost more to fill up my car or heat my home.
Exactly. But looking at the cargo, stranded on either side of that strait, chemicals, fertilizers, grains, it's clear this is not just a transportation problem.
No, it is a fundamental chemistry problem.
Exactly. I want to move past the idea of natural gas just being fuel. Because if we look at the industrial reality the source points to, natural gas is the literal chemical foundation for modern agriculture.
It really is.
So explain the mechanics of that to us, because the leap from a blocked strait to a global food crisis, it hinges entirely on this mechanism.
Sure. So it all comes down to synthetic nitrogen fertilizer, which quite literally keeps roughly half the global population alive.
Half the planet.
Yeah. And the manufacturing process, called the Haber-Bosch process, requires immense amounts of natural gas, but it doesn't just burn the gas for heat to run the factory.
Right, it's not just running the generator.
Exactly. The natural gas is the physical chemical feedstock. They take the methane from the natural gas, separate out the hydrogen, and then chemically bond it with nitrogen from the air under extreme heat and pressure to create ammonia.
So the natural gas isn't just powering the machine making the fertilizer.
Right.
The natural gas physically becomes the fertilizer.
Yes, exactly. So when the physical flow of natural gas is cut off by warships in the Strait of Hormuz, and global prices surge by 74% in 72 hours.
The fertilizer plants they freak out.
Right. Plants operating anywhere in the world suddenly find their primary raw ingredient is just totally unaffordable. The plants either pass that massive cost on, or more likely, they just halt production because operating at those margins is financial suicide.
And meanwhile, you have massive cargo ships specifically carrying finished fertilizer and the precursor chemicals to make it physically trapped outside the conflict zone.
Yep.
You've disrupted the raw materials, the finished goods, and the fuel to move them all at the exact same geographic pinch point.
Which is why the source shifts its focus so heavily away from the combatants. I mean, the West and the Middle East are the epicenter of the explosion, but the history breakdown makes a devastating case that the most severe structural damage is landing on the African continent.
They actually call Africa the unintended victim. Collateral damage on a continental scale.
It's a tragic reality.
Let's dig into the agricultural reality of that, because the source focuses specifically on small-scale agricultural trade. We aren't talking about massive automated corporate farms that can hedge their chemical costs on futures markets.
No, we are talking about millions of independent farmers operating on incredibly thin margins. These farmers rely on imported, affordable fertilizer to maintain soil yields that actually produce a marketable surplus.
Right.
So if a 74% spike in natural gas translates into a massive spike in synthetic fertilizer, those farmers simply cannot purchase the inputs this season.
And biology doesn't care about geopolitical conflicts. If you don't put the nitrogen in the soil today,
you don't get the crop yield tomorrow. It's a hard physical limitation.
wow.
Yeah, so a short-term geopolitical spat over a waterway immediately metastasizes into a long-term structural food crisis. If fertilizer is too expensive during the planting window, that food is permanently deleted from the future supply.
You're engineering a famine out of a maritime traffic jam. That is horrifying. But the source points out that the cost of the actual fertilizer, or the fuel, is only half the equation.
Right.
They describe the cost of living doing a full-blown acrobat show, which is a wildly vivid way to describe supply chain mechanics breaking down.
I love that phrase. And it's because the logistics costs are compounding the commodity costs.
Right. Let's unpack the mechanics of that acrobat show. It's not just that the oil inside the ship is more expensive, it's the cost of the ship itself.
Yes.
The force mentions skyrocketing freight rates and bunker fuel, but the real silent killer here is maritime insurance premiums.
That is a critical point that often goes overlooked. When a waterway becomes an active war zone, insurance markets panic just as violently as commodity markets.
Really? How does that work?
Well, organizations like Lloyd's of London have a joint war committee that officially designates certain waters as high risk.
And once that designation drops, the baseline insurance your ship carries is essentially voided for that area.
Yeah, precisely. To sail anywhere near that region, a shipping company has to purchase a specific war risk premium. And in peacetime, that might be a tiny fraction of a percent of the ship's total value.
Okay, sure.
But when missiles are flying, that premium can jump to 5, sometimes even 10% of the hull's value per voyage.
Wait, per voyage? So if you have a massive tanker worth $100 million, the insurance company suddenly wants $5 million in cash just to cover the vessel for a single transit.
Yes. Plus the extra cost of the bunker fuel, because you are likely taking a massive detour to avoid the worst of the conflict zone, meaning you're burning thousands of tons of extra diesel.
All of those compounding costs, the 74% gas spike, the $90 oil, the millions in war risk insurance, the extra bunker fuel, they all get stacked up, securitized, and shoved straight down the supply chain until they land directly on the shoulders of Mama Mboga.
Let's define that for listeners outside of Kenya, because the source uses her as the ultimate microeconomic anchor for this global macro crisis.
Yeah, in Kenya, Mama Mboga literally translates to mother of vegetables.
Yeah.
She is the ubiquitous local vendor, the women running the small stalls in the informal markets, like Gikomba Market in Nairobi, which the source explicitly mentions.
They are the absolute backbone of food distribution in these communities.
They really are. They buy from the wholesalers or direct from farmers and sell to the households.
And they operate in a world of high-velocity, low-margin trade.
And they deal in survival staples. The source highlights Sukuma Wiki, which is collard greens. And I love the literal translation of Sukuma Wiki. It means to push the weak.
It's so descriptive.
It is the nutrient-dense, historically cheap vegetable that families rely on to stretch their meals when money runs out. It is the definition of inelastic demand. You buy it because you have to eat.
But the source issues a dire warning here. Because of this acrobat show of cascading logistics costs, even Sukuma Wiki is at risk of becoming a luxury item.
Think about the cruelty of that economic mechanism. The food you rely on because you cannot afford luxury suddenly becomes a luxury itself. When the diesel cost to transport the greens from the Rift Valley farms to the Gikomba market doubles, Mama Mboga's wholesale cost doubles. She has no choice but to double the retail price.
Which brings up the inevitable macroeconomic question, right? If this is an existential threat to the population, why doesn't the government step in?
Exactly. Why doesn't the Kenyan government or any other African nation facing this simply subsidize the fertilizer at the port or cap the price of diesel to protect Mama Mboga and the farmers?
The source diagnoses this vulnerability with a very specific clinical phrase. They call it limited fiscal space.
Yeah, I was looking at the sovereign debt profiles of these nations, and limited is putting it mildly. It's not just that they don't have a rainy day fund. It's that they are actively locked out of the mechanisms a sovereign state normally uses to absorb a shock.
Right. So explain that constraint, because it's vital to understanding why developing nations absorb these shocks so much harder than developed ones.
Well, when a developed economy faces an external shock like the US or the EU during COVID or an energy crisis, they have massive fiscal space.
Yeah.
They can issue new government bonds at very low interest rates, borrow billions of dollars from the future, and use that cash today to subsidize fuel or send checks to citizens.
They basically socialize the shock through debt.
Right. But many African nations, as the source implies, are already carrying massive, heavily structured sovereign debt burdens. Their Eurobond yields, like the interest rates international investors demand to lend them money, are often already in the double digits.
Wow.
Yeah, they literally cannot afford to borrow more money on the international market to pay for a subsidy.
And the alternative, like simply printing the local currency to pay for internal subsidy.
Oh, that triggers an immediate death spiral.
Right.
If they print currency, the currency depreciates against the US dollar.
Right. But oil, natural gas, and fertilizer are all priced globally in US dollars. So by printing money to help citizens afford imports, you instantly make all future imports astronomically more expensive. It's imported inflation on steroids, so they are fiscally trapped. They have zero shock absorbers. They are forced to let the brutal reality of the global market pass directly through to the citizen.
Which leads to the expert warning in the source. When you fuse together completely unaffordable baseline calories with a government that is fiscally paralyzed and incapable of intervening, you are brewing a historical textbook recipe for severe social unrest.
You are building a powder keg.
A powder keg in Nairobi, ignited by a naval skirmish thousands of miles away in the Persian Gulf. But Here is where the narrative of this deep dive takes a violently sharp turn.
Yeah, it really does.
Because while developing nations are being pushed to the brink of starvation and systemic unrest, the history source introduces a major, almost jarring geopolitical plot twist.
There is a massive beneficiary in this chaos.
Russia. Russia is the unexpected, overwhelming winner of the Strait of Hormuz closure.
It really highlights the cold, mechanical reality of the geopolitical chessboard.
The data points in the source are staggering. They state that Russia's oil revenue doubled to $9 billion in the month of April 2026 alone. $9 billion in a single month.
And the forward-looking projection is even more intense.
Really?
Yeah. The source notes that if oil stays around the $100 a barrel mark, which the market is heavily pressuring it to do with Hormuz clamped shut, Russia stands to capture an extra $71.8 billion annually.
Wait, extra? That's on top of baseline revenue?
Yes, an additional $71.8 billion.
That is, the source frames the scale of that windfall perfectly. That is enough capital to entirely fund a small country, or to sustain a massive, prolonged war effort indefinitely. It is pure financial momentum generated entirely from the instability of their geopolitical rivals.
But we really need to look at the physical infrastructure making this possible. Why is Russia able to capture this windfall when the Middle East is paralyzed?
That's the crucial question. Are they just price gouging whatever ships they have in the water, or is this a structural advantage?
It is deeply structural. The source points out that Russia is aggressively positioning itself as the reliable alternative. And they can make that claim because of overland pipelines.
Oh, right. The ESBO pipeline, the power of Siberia. This is where geography dictates economics.
Exactly. When the Middle Eastern oil routes are shut down, it is because maritime choke points are vulnerable to naval blockades, mines, and anti-ship missiles. But a pipeline stretching thousands of miles across the Siberian permafrost directly into Asian markets.
It doesn't care about a war in the Persian Gulf.
Not at all.
A pipeline is a dedicated, physically protected, point-to-point road that only you control.
Russia is stepping into the vacuum created by the USA-Iran conflict, loudly broadcasting to the world that their pipelines are fully operational, immune to naval warfare, and just open for business. They are completely capitalizing on the panic.
But hold on, let me push back on this reliable alternative concept for a second. A pipeline might be immune to a submarine, but it has severe physical limitations. You can't just infinitely increase the flow of a pipeline because oil prices are high. There are hard thermodynamic ceilings on how much crude you can pump through a 48-inch steel tube in a day.
That's a fair point.
And more importantly, a pipeline only goes to one specific place. You can't reroute it mid-journey like a cargo ship. Russia can't just pump oil into a void. Someone massive with an insatiable appetite for energy has to be bolted to the other end of that pipe.
Which brings us precisely to the other side of the Asian continent. Russia's windfall relies entirely on the desperation of the world's largest manufacturing engine. We have to pivot to China's immense strategic dilemma.
Yes. The source highlights China's intensely precarious position here, and it is a vulnerability that defines their entire modern geopolitical strategy. The history breakdown states that 45 to 50% of China's total crude oil imports rely on passing through the Strait of Hormuz.
Almost half. Half of the energy required to run the factories, the ports, the internal logistics network of a nation of over 1 billion people is forced to squeeze through one active war zone.
If we go back to the vascular analogy, 50% of China's lifeblood flows through a blocked artery. It's a strategic nightmare. But the source notes that Beijing isn't completely caught off guard. They have an emergency kit.
Right, the Strategic Petroleum Reserve, or SPR.
Right. And the source provides a fascinating, highly specific metric. China holds enough oil in these strategic reserves to cover exactly 7 months of the imports that would normally transit via Hormuz.
7 months. It's a number that requires deep analysis because it represents a very rigid ticking clock.
From a civilian perspective, having 7 months of backup supplies sounds incredibly robust. If my household had 7 months of food and fuel stored up, I'd feel invincible.
Sure, but from a macroeconomic and industrial standpoint, 7 months is the blink of an eye. You cannot re-architect a global supply chain that took 50 years to build in 28 weeks.
And the mechanics of drawing down an SPR are not linear. I was digging into this. And you can't just turn a valve and replace 50% of your imports flawlessly.
No, it's really complicated.
As you drain the massive salt caverns and tanks, the physical pressure drops. Extraction slows down. Plus, there's a massive logistical mismatch. The refineries in China are calibrated for the specific chemical profiles of Middle Eastern crude down, which is often heavy and sour.
Right.
If the SPR has a different blend, or if the Russian overland pipelines are delivering the ESPO blend, which is a lighter, sweeter crude, the refineries physically cannot process it at the same speed.
Exactly. The yields drop, bottlenecks form. So that 7-month timeline isn't a comfortable buffer. It is an absolute maximum theoretical limit before systemic failure.
The clock is ticking deafeningly loud in Beijing. Every barrel they pull from the reserve is a step closer to industrial paralysis. So how does the source say China is reacting to this countdown?
They highlight a two-pronged strategy. The first connects directly to our previous point. A massive deepening of geopolitical ties with Russia. China needs overland oil immediately to bypass the maritime threat, and Russia has the pipelines and the crude.
So you see this intense tightening of the Moscow-Beijing energy embrace, forged purely out of mutual necessity.
But this does not happen in a vacuum. The source explicitly mentions that the United States is watching this energy alliance incredibly closely. The U.S. is actively issuing warnings to China, cautioning them against using this energy trade to indirectly support Iran or subvert existing Western sanctions.
The geopolitical chessboard is hyper-congested. Every physical movement of a barrel of oil is treated as a hostile political maneuver. But it's the second prong of China's reaction that I found to be the most profound paradox of this entire source material.
You mean the hyper-acceleration of the green energy transition?
Yes. Think about the incredible irony presented here. We are analyzing a devastating kinetic war fought over fossil fuel logistics. An oil and gas choke point is paralyzing the globe. And yet, this exact conflict might serve as the catalyst for the fastest, most aggressive global shift toward renewable energy adoption in human history.
When you analyze it from Beijing's national security perspective, it makes total ruthless sense. They are staring at that 7-month ticking clock. They are looking at the vulnerability of the Strait of Hormuz, and they are arriving at a stark conclusion. Importing fossil fuels makes the nation fundamentally weak.
Because as long as your economy requires a ship to bring you fuel, a rival navy can always sink the ship, or mine the strait, or blockade the port.
But if you generate your energy domestically...
Nobody can embargo the sun, nobody can blockade the wind.
Exactly. The source suggests that China's massive trillion-dollar investments into solar, wind, and domestic nuclear aren't just climate policies. They are urgent, foundational national security imperatives. They are attempting to permanently decouple their industrial engine from the volatility of Middle Eastern maritime choke points.
They are electrifying their vehicle fleet, not just to clear the smog in Beijing, but so they don't need the oil trapped behind the U.S.-Iran war. It is an incredible strategic pivot, but there's a massive but. While superpowers play this high-stakes, multi-decade game of chess with pipelines, 7-month reserves, and trillion-dollar green transitions, the everyday citizen does not have a 7-month strategic reserve of anything.
They do not. And this is where the sweeping macroeconomic theories crash violently into human reality.
We have to strip away the geopolitical extraction. We need to translate what $90 a barrel and 74% gas spikes actually mean on the ground, which the history source does brilliantly. This is the human element.
It is vital we don't lose sight of this. A global benchmark price is just a number on a screen until it interacts with the local economy.
The source explains exactly how that translation works. That $90 barrel instantly dictates the price of unga maize flour across East Africa. It dictates the fare a commuter pays to physically get to their job. It dictates the psychological weight of wondering if the lights will turn on.
The breakdown looks specifically at how this dynamic compresses and destroys small businesses. They introduce the brutal reality of evaporating profit margins.
Let's walk through the mechanics of that margin compression, because it explains why local economies freeze. Imagine a small business owner in Kenya, maybe someone running a light manufacturing shop or a local delivery service, or even Mama Mboga.
Right.
Suddenly, the cost of their raw materials, driven by global logistics and fuel, skyrockets by 50%. The traditional economic assumption is, okay, costs go up, you just pass the cost on to the consumer. You raise your prices 50%. Why doesn't that work here?
Because your consumers are the very people whose household budgets have already been entirely consumed by the rising cost of basic food staples. They have zero elasticity left.
Right. If you raise your delivery fee by 50% just to cover your new diesel costs and break even, your customers simply stop hiring you. They can't afford it.
So the small business owner is trapped in a vice. You either raise prices and instantly lose your entire customer base, or you absorb the rising costs yourself in a desperate bid to maintain market share.
But absorbing the costs means your profit margin, The money you take home to feed your own family entirely vanishes. You are working 14-hour days, moving products, servicing customers, but the business is generating zero actual income.
You are effectively subsidizing your customer survival by burning through your own business capital.
Which is mathematically unsustainable. The local vendors, the small-scale manufacturers, they're being forced to act as the financial shock absorbers for a global superpower conflict, and the source makes it clear that they are breaking under the pressure.
Which leads to the most urgent question the source addresses. When the business margins are gone, when the governments are paralyzed by debt and cannot intervene, how do these communities, specifically in Kenya, actually survive this suffocating pressure?
They adapt. The source provides this incredibly compelling on-the-ground look at human resilience, at the hustle, and the cultural coping mechanisms that deploy when formal economic systems completely fail.
The primary adaptation is the aggressive diversification of income, the side hustle.
It's forced hyper-entrepreneurialism.
Yeah.
The concept of a single, stable job disappears.
Exactly. When the purchasing power of your primary salary is eaten alive by inflation and transport costs in real time, the household has to instantly splinter its labor.
Yeah.
A person might work a formal job during the day, but at night they are operating a small kiosk, or moving goods in the informal market, or leveraging digital platforms for freelance microtasks.
You have to stitch together 3 or 4 fragmented income streams just to match the caloric purchasing power your single job had a month ago.
It is an exhausting, relentless physical and mental grind driven by pure survival necessity.
But the source brings up a cultural insight that elevates this analysis beyond just economics. It's not just about the physical hustle, it's about psychological survival.
Yeah.
And the primary tool for that, fascinatingly, is humor.
Yes. The source heavily emphasizes Kenyans using humor, memes, and deeply sarcastic jokes as a societal coping mechanism.
They give specific examples of citizens creating viral memes about having to literally walk miles to work because the matatu fares have become completely unmoored from reality.
It is a profound societal response to crisis.
I have to ask about the optics of this, because if an outside observer sees a population making social media jokes about a crippling economic crisis, the immediate assumption might be, oh, they are taking this lightly. It must not be that severe. Is that a misreading of the situation?
It is a massive, fundamental misreading. The source is razor sharp on this point. The humor is not complacency. The humor is a mask.
A mask for what? What is underneath the memer?
Beneath the laughter is a well of profound, deep, and dangerous frustration. The humor acts as a societal release valve for psychological pressure that would otherwise trigger an explosion.
When you are entirely, completely powerless to affect a massive geopolitical event that is actively destroying your ability to feed your children. Sometimes the only shred of human agency you have left is the ability to point out the sheer absurdity of it.
To mock the system that is crushing you. It is an assertion of dignity. It is a way for the community to collectively say, we see exactly how broken and unfair this is. We are suffering immensely, but we refuse to let you part our spirit.
The source synthesizes the core underlying anger of this community perfectly. It is about the fundamental injustice of global architecture.
They use a phrase that is absolutely devastating in its clarity. It is the feeling of paying a debt we didn't borrow.
Paying a debt we didn't borrow. That is the entire crisis in 7 words. You have 2 massive global powers, 2 bullies in a hallway half a world away, engaged in a kinetic conflict that has absolutely nothing to do with Kenya, nothing to do with the farmers in the Rift Valley, and nothing to do with Mama Mboga.
And yet, because of the hyper-fragile, hyper-interconnected nature of modern trade,
because 129 ships are parked outside a 21-mile strip of water,
the natural gas feedstock for the Haber-Bosch process spikes, the fertilizer becomes unaffordable, the logistics costs do an acrobat show, the sovereign debt markets lock up,
and a family in Nairobi has to skip meals. It is the ultimate brutal realization of the butterfly effect. But it's not a butterfly flapping its wings. It is warships blockading an artery.
It proves that in a fully globalized economy, there is no such thing as a localized conflict. A choke point is a shared vulnerability for every single human being who participates in the market.
Well, on that intensely sobering note, let's pull all of these massive threads together. Thank you for joining us on this incredibly dense deep dive.
It has been a complex, vital journey through the mechanics of a crisis.
We started by identifying the vascular constriction, the blocked Matatu route of global trade at the Strait of Hormuz. We traced how halting those 129 ships triggered immediate violent panic in the commodity markets, sparking that 74% natural gas surge.
We unpacked the chemistry and economics of how that gas spike metastasized into a synthetic fertilizer crisis, directly threatening African agricultural yields and pushing fiscally paralyzed, debt-burdened nations toward the brink of social unrest.
We analyzed the geopolitical chessboard reacting in real time, with Russia capturing a multi-billion-dollar windfall by leveraging their overland pipelines to position themselves as the new reliable alternative.
We examined China's terrifying 7-month SPR ticking clock, forcing an unprecedented massive acceleration toward domestic renewable energy, not for climate, but to escape maritime vulnerability.
And finally, we grounded the macroeconomic theories in human reality. The evaporating profit margins of small businesses, the relentless hyper-entrepreneurial hustle, and the profound resilience of communities using humor to mask the deep frustration of paying a debt they didn't borrow.
Which leaves us with a critical structural question to look toward the future.
I know you always have a final provocative thought to leave us with. What should we be mulling over as we look at the maps tonight?
Consider the massive capital expenditures we discussed. Nations like China are reacting to this shock not by waiting for it to end, but by aggressively and permanently restructuring their trade routes. They are cementing new overland pipeline alliances. They are pouring trillions into domestic renewable energy grids. All of this is designed specifically to bypass the vulnerability of the Strait of Hormuz.
They are spending hundreds of billions of dollars to build a world that simply doesn't need that strait.
Exactly. So here's the question to explore. What happens when this USA-Iran conflict finally ends? If the biggest energy consumers in the world spend the next 5 years successfully rewiring their entire industrial economies to survive without the Strait of Hormuz, will the strait, once the most important geographic artery in the global economy, find itself permanently bypassed and strategically obsolete? Are we not just witnessing a temporary shipping crisis, but the permanent, irreversible rewiring of global trade?
That is a staggering paradigm shift. If the old road finally opens back up and nobody wants to drive on it anymore because they were forced to build a better, safer highway, it is a massive question about the future of geopolitics. And I want to encourage you, the listener, to look around your own environment. Think about the goods in your local store, the fuel in your car, the food on your table. How insulated are you really from these distant global choke points? Could your local market survive if the global Matatu route shut down tomorrow? Thank you so much for your time today. We love untangling these incredibly complex webs with you. Until next time, stay curious and keep diving deep.